Welcome everyone. In this video, we are going over questions 1 to 10 of ACER's Green booklet, which is also just called Practice Test. As always, please make sure you have the correct edition in front of you. I'm using the second edition. And if you have any questions, comments, feedback, need extra help, send me an email or go to the website. Okay, so this is a unit where if you just quickly skim it, you'll see that there's 4 comments that we need to address. And then if you go down to questions 8 to 10, you'll see that they are sort of the compare and contrast questions where you're asked to compare between different comments. Now, normally I would say build a table for something like this. I don't think a table is really going to work in this situation, mainly because there's so many questions to get through and it's not as easy. But what I do think you should do is after every comment, like on your sheet of paper, and I'll do it up here, just have like a word or two for each comment so you can remember what comments are what, which should help later. Now, it's also very important that you read the blurb before getting into the questions. So in this case, we're told that in February 1994, the Brisbane Courier Mail predicted that the Premier ordered a draft for a Year 5 social studies book to be rewritten. He deemed it unacceptable that the book's recommendation that teachers refer to the European arrivals in Australia as invasion rather than settlement. And the book had also suggested that teachers not use the word explore, da 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 da. So, what does the Premier argue? He wants it to say settlement rather than invasion. So, if you just keep that in the back of your head, then it sort of helps with what the comments are saying. Okay, so comment 1. According to comment 1, using the term settlement to describe the arrival of the British is. So always look for the emotive words or phrases. So comment 1 talks about how, criticism has been made of the curriculum in the past few years, not just because it gives a false picture of the way things were, but also because such a biased account. Now, these are very emotive words. And it goes on to say a biased account can actually be harmful. And then it specifically talks about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students who have to sit through the lessons. So, what is the main point? The main point of comment 1 is that it is offensive to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders when you use the word settlement and discovered rather than invasion. Okay, so we're just going to go back up, and I'm just going to say I'm going to use the word harmful. And I'm also going to write students to remind me that this comment is really focusing on the harm to the students. Comment 2. So comment 2 suggests that the decisive factor when considering whether to use the word invasion or settlement is. So again, key bit, decisive factor. So there may be multiple factors, but what is the big one, the decisive one? So what it does is it talks about the preferred terminology and it compares Hitler's occupation of Europe to the European settlement. And what it says is that Governor Philip and those who sailed with him did not see themselves in taking part in an invasion that will lead to occupation by force. They saw themselves, the people on the boats coming to Australia, they saw themselves as settlers. They didn't think that they were invading, they thought that they were settling. Whereas when you think about, Hitler's occupation of Poland, they were using the word occupation and invasion. So when Hitler was deciding to go and invade Poland, he wasn't thinking, I'm going to go and settle Poland. He was thinking, I am going to invade. This is an act of war. I will be invading them. So the argument is saying that you have to take into account what the people at the time saw themselves as doing. And when it comes to Europeans settling in Australia, they saw themselves as settlers, whereas in Nazi Germany, they saw themselves as invaders. So that's what comment 2 is arguing, and therefore the answer option is C. Question 3, which also talks about comment 2, the particular examples of invasion and occupation used for comparison in comment 2 seem chosen to. So, what examples have been used? We've got like the Australian settlement or invasion, whatever you want to call it, and then we've got World War II and Hitler. Now, um, I think it goes without saying that the minute you bring up World War II and in particular Hitler, emotions rise. Like, if you want to call somebody the worst thing in the world you could imagine, you call them like a Nazi, you say that, this is what Hitler did, or there's that sort of joke that says the first person to bring up Hitler in an argument immediately loses that argument, right? So it's an emotive act that this commenter is using. They're picking like one of the greatest atrocities in human history and using that deliberately because it's quite emotive. And then that points you to option C, which is associate the words with regimes of modern history from which most Australians would want to disassociate themselves. Most Australians would not want to be associated with Hitler or Nazi Germany or that behavior. And so by picking those words, you make people feel uncomfortable, and that's the point of it. Let's just go to the other one. So, A, draw a distinction between the motives behind invasions perpetrated by left-wing and right-wing authoritarian regime. My first question is, what was the left-wing or the right-wing authoritarian regime? That doesn't really make sense. And also, those words are quite modern words as well. I don't think left and right wing were used at the time. B, remind readers that consequences of the 20th century had their inspiration in a long European history of imperialism. That's irrelevant. And that's also like saying, Hitler read the history of Australia and saw the arrival of the British in Australia and then decided he was going to do something similar. I mean, it's a bit absurd, that one. And then D, open up the discussion to include other contexts where debate is still going on about the interpretation of historical events. So when it comes to the British arriving in Australia, there is still a debate ongoing about whether or not it was an invasion, it was in a settlement, and that's what this whole passage is about. But there's pretty much no debate about Hitler's actions. That is not really open to interpretation. Everyone is pretty much on the same page about what he did. And so, therefore, that is factually incorrect and also it's irrelevant in the context of the answer. So, that is why the correct option here is C. Okay, question 4. How does comment 3 view the words invasion and settlement in the context of the British arrival in Australia? So, let's actually look at how the words are used. It starts off. Australia was invaded. Australia was invaded. That invasion was resisted and the resistance was crushed. But the British were settlers as well. But the British were settlers as well. So it uses the word invasion and it uses the word settlers. So what does that tell us? It tells us that each of the two words legitimately describes an aspect of the events, which is option C. Australia was invaded and then it was settled. That's what this comment is saying. A, the words are equally inappropriate. It doesn't mention the words being inappropriate, it just uses both of them. B, the two words can be used interchangeably. No, because it specifically says in the fourth sentence, line 2, it specifically says one fact does not cancel out the other. It's saying Australia was invaded and it was then settled. But one fact does not cancel out the other, so it can't be B. And then D, the earliest British arrivals must be regarded as invaders, but later arrivals were settlers. This is people that get this wrong bring their own external outside knowledge in. Don't make assumptions. Don't bring your own outside knowledge in. It is not telling us that, the first 100 people to arrive were invaders and then the second 100 people to arrive were settlers. It's not drawing that distinction between the two of them. It's not drawing a time, in history saying it was invaded till this date and then from this date onwards it was settled. It's just saying it was invaded and it was settled. It may both have happened at the same time. It may have happened one after the other. There's still debate about whether or not that happened and how it's to be interpreted. So D is wrong, and please don't make assumptions. Question 5. Oh, and sorry, I have completely forgotten to go up here and fill this in. So this is why it's helpful to have it on a little table next to you. So comment 2 is talking about, I'm just going to write World War II here. This is one that remind me that's the Hitler one. And then comment 3 is I'm going to do I for invasion versus S for settlers. Okay, so that's quickly going to remind me what all the comments are about. Okay, question 5. Comment 4 argues, keyword there, argues that any view of historical events. So it says that history is being used to compensate for a lack of identity. Let me just find that exactly. Okay, so that's not exactly what it says, but that is how I've interpreted it. It's saying that history is being used to compensate for a lack of identity. So A needs constant revision in light of political changes. No, because it only says all historical accounts are also political accounts. So it's just saying historical accounts are also political accounts, but it's not going that next step and then saying you need to revise it. So it's kind of doing the first bit by linking historical and political accounts together, but it's not then saying, so therefore we need to rewrite history based on what's happening in political changes. Okay, now you could argue that that is what's happening in the broader context of this passage, with the Premier saying that the drafts of the books have to be rewritten. But this particular comment is not talking about that. This particular comment is just saying all historical accounts are also political accounts. So don't go that next step and then make that link when you're not meant to. B is just irrelevant. So now it comes down to C and D. And this is where I want you to compare the language here. So C, should be determined. C, should be. D, will always be. Now remember, the key verb was argues. So which one, if you forget everything else I've just said, which one of these is arguing? If I want to make an argument, would I stand up and say, we should be considering this? Or will I stand up and say, we will always be doing this or considering this? Well, hopefully you can see that D is an argument. C is not an argument, it is a suggestion. So therefore, the answer is D, because that is the only thing that's being argued. And if we read the rest of D, will always be conditioned by the values and perspective of viewer. That is correct. Whereas C is not what it's pushing either, right? So D is correct because one, it's a correct statement, but also two, it's the only one that actually matches the word argues. So if you're really struggling, try and match the answer to the verb in the question. Because if your answer is not an argument, then it can't be the correct answer. Question 6. What are the connotations of the word political as it is used in the first line of comment 4? So let's have a look. All historical accounts are also political accounts, telling a story about the past which makes sense and appeals to a particular group of people while repelling others. So that's what it says. So comment 4. Again, we break down our double-barreled answers. So A, useful. Is it useful? It could be useful, political arguments, as it says here. Is it pragmatic, though? No. So we get rid of that. Artificial? Maybe. Self-serving? Yes. C, to do with power and ideology? That's both correct. It's to do with power, because political and power. And ideology? Yes, because it's talking about different groups. So that is correct for the two of them. D, to do with the institutions of government. I mean, that is correct because, politics is government and institution, that kind of overlaps, but it's not answering the question here. So here the answer is C. Okay, question 7. Comment 4 suggests that the interpretation of Australia's past as a history of exploration and pioneering arises from. So what I've said is C, question 5, because this is another one trick the GAMSAT does where they kind of double up on questions. So question 5 talks about, how we're always, how you have to view historical events. And we said that it was D, will always be conditioned by the values and perspective of the viewer. So with that in mind, we can look at question 7. A blatant rejection of historical fact. No, because they're not rejecting historical fact. B, the need to find a palatable national self-image. Yes, that is correct. And if you go to the comment and read it in more detail, it talks about historical identity, as I said before for question 5. So it says in line 2, one preference is for a story about Australia's past, which I would argue uses the history of pioneering exploration as a crutch to lean on the absence of some more compelling form of historical identity, such as a struggle for liberty. So it's saying the reason we have this past where we're saying, they're all pioneers and explorers is because we don't have a strong national identity. Think about like the USA, the US, things like independence, 4th of July, freedom, those values perpetuate every part of of modern US culture because of their past with the revolution and the break from the British. What this comment is saying there is that Australia doesn't have something like that. So our next best option is to have this history of exploration and pioneering to fulfill that in itself, that national identity, which is a problem if you then start to challenge it by saying, well, you weren't explorers, you were invaders. So hopefully that all sort of makes sense. Yes, okay, so that's why the answer here is B. Okay, question 8. So now we're getting to the part where we compare and contrast comments. So which of the following comments seems most sympathetic to the interpretation of history originally recommended in the draft of the Year 5 Social Studies book? So that's when we need to go back to the context. So what happened? We're in 1994. They've written a draft for the Social Studies book, which uses the word settlement, which uses the word invasion. See, even I'm now getting confused. So it uses the word invasion. The Premier doesn't like that and wants them to use the word settlement. So you could say the Year 5 Social Studies book, the draft wants to use the word invasion. Which of the 4 comments is most sympathetic to that? Well, if we think about the 4 comments very quickly, I think you can say that it is easily comment 1, which is the comment that talks about the feelings of, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in the class having to hear that their land was settled when it was actually invaded. So that is why the answer here is A. 9. Which of the comments suggests that Question 9. Which of the comments suggests that not only historical fact, but the views and values of the present are crucial in forming an interpretation of the past? So now this is one where we need to sort of compare and contrast. So we're going to go up to a little summary over here. And obviously when you do this, you'll do this on the paper or the whiteboard on the exam instead of scrolling up and down multiple times. So we're interested in historical facts, but also the views and values of the present. So comment number 1, this was the one that was talking about how it's harmful to the students by using the terminology that the governor proposed. But it's also talking about like historical facts because it's talking about, in the past, this is what was accepted to say. So we can say that comment 1 is correct, which is great. So if we know that comment 1 is correct, then we can immediately knock out B and D because they're the only 2 answer options that don't have comment 1. The difference between A and C is A is comment 1 only, and C is comment 1 and 4. So now we have to look at comment 4 and say, is comment 4 considering historical facts and the views and values of the present? Yes, it is, because it's talking about, political identity, national self-image, but it also talks about facts. Um, it doesn't just say you have to ignore the facts. It's saying, it says good history teaching is about showing the limits and the context in any particular view of the past. So it's talking about historical facts. And so therefore, 4 is also correct, which makes the correct answer as C. Okay, so it's comment 1 and comment 4. So when you have, again, these sort of compare contrast ones, look to see, is there an easy way that I can knock out a bunch of comments? Or is there an easy way I can knock out a bunch of answer options just by being a bit strategic here? Okay, and finally, I know it's a long video, I apologize. Question 10. Which of the comments imply or state disapproval of Mr. Goss's actions in ordering the Year 5 social study books to be written? So remember, what did he want, Mr. Goss, the Premier? He did not want the new version. So we could just say what did he want? He liked the word settlement. So we already know the answer to this very quickly. We know that comment 1 disapproves. We've just looked at comment 1 3 times in the last 3 questions. Why? Because it talks about the students and the impact on the students. So therefore, if we know that comment 1 is correct, so therefore we knock out A, we knock out B, and we knock out D, because they don't have comment 1 in them. So now we just have to double check C. So C is comment 1 and comment 3. So now we think about comment 3. Does this also disapprove of the actions? And comment 3 is the one that says Australia was invaded and it was settled. But you can't, one fact does not uh, cancel out the other. And so therefore it's also disapproving because it also uses the word settlement. And so therefore C is the correct answer. So that was very quick to get to once you know, okay, 1 is correct. Now I just have to double check 3. I've double checked it, tick, tick, happy, and we go for answer option C. Hopefully that makes sense, and I'll see you in the next video.